The room fell silent, a heavy, suffocating blanket descending upon the men gathered in the frigid confines of the wolf's lair. It was February the 2nd, 1943, and the air crackled not with electricity, but with an almost unbearable tension. They could barely look at each other, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and a dawning, terrible understanding. For 91 agonizing days, they had watched, helpless, as the Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, slowly, brutally died in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. The increasingly desperate, often garbled radio transmissions from General Paulus had been their real-time tormentors, a constant, chilling countdown. Then, that very morning, the transmissions simply stopped. Just the previous summer, over 300,000 German soldiers had marched with an almost arrogant confidence into the city on the Volga. Now, a mere 91,000 starving, frostbitten, and utterly broken survivors were being marched into grim Soviet captivity. Of those, a truly horrifying statistic, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Joseph Goebbels, his usually cunning eyes clouded with a rare uncertainty, stood poised with his crack propaganda team, waiting. They desperately needed guidance, a clear directive on how to spin this unimaginable catastrophe to the German public. The Soviet victory, a triumph of almost mythical proportions, was already being broadcast on every Allied radio station across the globe. Moscow was erupting in spontaneous, ecstatic celebrations in the streets, a roar of vindication. Winston Churchill, his voice booming with renewed resolve, was delivering speeches about the turning tide of the war. There was no hiding what had happened. The sheer scale of the disaster was too immense. Every German family with a son, a father, a husband in the Sixth Army knew the truth in their bones, a cold, hard certainty that settled deep in their souls, even if the official word hadn't yet come. Suddenly, the doors swung open, and Adolf Hitler entered the room. The atmosphere, already thick with dread, changed immediately, becoming even more charged, more volatile. His hands were shaking, witnesses later reported, a tremor far more violent than the subtle, nervous twitch that had begun appearing in recent months. He had barely slept since January 31st, when Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, defying an explicit and personal order, had surrendered instead of fighting to the death, or, as Hitler had chillingly expected, committing suicide. The Führer had even promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th, a heavy-handed and utterly unmistakable hint. No German Field Marshal had ever been captured alive in history. Paulus was supposed to understand what was expected of him, a glorious, final self-sacrifice for the Reich. He chose survival instead, a choice Hitler viewed as the ultimate betrayal. What Hitler said next, his voice quiet but laced with an absolute, terrifying conviction, would become one of the strangest, most bizarre, and ultimately most futile orders of the entire war. He fixed his gaze on Goebbels and spoke. The word Stalingrad was to be eliminated from official use, not minimized, not reframed, not spun, but utterly eliminated. German newspapers were forbidden from printing it. Radio broadcasters could not utter it. Military dispatches were to use vague geographic coordinates or simply refer to the Southern Front. Any soldier caught using the forbidden word could face severe disciplinary action. It was as if Hitler, in a desperate, delusional act of magical thinking, believed that by erasing the name, he could somehow erase the crushing defeat itself, making it simply vanish from history and memory. Goebbels, a true master of propaganda who had spent a decade bending reality to fit the warped Nazi narrative, was utterly stunned. He had prepared an arsenal of strategies, minimizing the disaster, framing it as a heroic last stand against impossible odds, blaming the Soviets' overwhelming numerical superiority or the unprecedented severity of the Russian winter. But pretending it didn't exist? That Stalingrad wasn't Stalingrad? He knew immediately, with a cold certainty, that this was an act of profound insanity. The German people weren't stupid. They could count. They knew which units had been sent east, into the yawning maw of the Russian steppe. They knew which sons and husbands weren't coming home, their names added to an ever-growing list of the vanished. Yet Hitler's twisted logic, if one could even call it that, possessed a disturbing internal consistency. Stalingrad had become far more than just a city. It was a symbol, a name that carried psychological weight and political resonance far beyond its strategic importance. The Soviets had, after all, deliberately renamed it after Stalin himself in 1925, transforming Tsaritsyn into a living monument to their leader's cult of personality. When Hitler, driven by a similar ego and a desire to humiliate his adversary, ordered the Wehrmacht to take it in the summer of 1942, the battle instantly became a deeply personal contest between the two dictators. Taking Stalin's city would not only be a strategic victory, but a profound psychological blow, a public humiliation of the Soviet leader, and a definitive proof of German superiority. Losing it, conversely, would do the exact opposite. For months, German propaganda had trumpeted every street captured, every factory seized, every block secured. The public had been repeatedly told that Stalingrad would fall any day now. Goebbels himself had written glowing articles about the inevitable victory, about how the Soviets were senselessly throwing away lives defending a pile of rubble that no longer held any military value. He had even, in a grotesque foreshadowing of hubris, commissioned a celebratory symphony that was supposed to premiere once the city finally fell. The first movement was optimistically titled, "The March to Stalingrad." It would, of course, never be performed. The initial German offensive in summer 1942, codenamed Operation Blau, had been a masterpiece of mobile warfare. The Sixth Army under Paulus, alongside the Fourth Panzer Army, had swept across the vast southern Soviet Union, covering hundreds of miles in mere weeks, their blitzkrieg tactics seemingly unstoppable. They reached the Volga River and began fighting their way into the city itself in September. The battle devolved into a grinding, brutal urban nightmare, block by block, building by building, sometimes room by room. The Germans pushed forward, suffering horrific casualties but slowly gaining ground. By November, they controlled roughly 90% of Stalingrad. Victory seemed not just inevitable, but assured. Hitler confidently told his inner circle that the city was effectively secured. Then, on November 19, 1942, the Soviets unleashed Operation Uranus. They had been quietly, secretly massing vast forces north and south of the city for weeks, building up staggering reserves while feeding just enough troops into Stalingrad itself to keep the Germans endlessly engaged in attritional street fighting. The Soviet pincers, a massive mechanized assault, smashed through the thinly spread and poorly equipped Romanian and Italian armies protecting the German flanks. Within days, the two spearheads met west of the city, completing a devastating encirclement. The entire German Sixth Army, along with elements of the Fourth Panzer Army and various Axis Allied units, over 300,000 German and Axis soldiers in total, were trapped in a vast, frozen pocket. Hermann Göring, the bombastic and self-serving commander of the Luftwaffe, recklessly promised Hitler that his planes could supply the encircled pocket by air. He guaranteed 500 tons of supplies per day, a fantasy amount. supposedly enough to keep the Sixth Army fighting until a relief force could break through the Soviet lines. It was a lie, a delusion of epic proportions. The Luftwaffe never delivered even half that amount on any single day. Most days, they managed less than 100 tons. Pilots, many barely trained, flew their Junkers Ju-52 transport planes through relentless Soviet anti-aircraft fire and swarms of fighter planes, attempting to land on makeshift airstrips that were constantly under artillery bombardment. Planes were shot down, crash-landed in blizzards, or simply froze solid on the ground. Inside the pocket, the men began to starve, their emaciated bodies slowly succumbing to the cold and hunger. Paulus and his senior officers sent increasingly desperate messages, pleading for permission to attempt a breakout while they still had some fuel and ammunition. Hitler, however, refused. He had publicly declared that German soldiers would hold Stalingrad and never retreat. To abandon it now, to sanction a retreat, would be to admit defeat, a concept anathema to his rigid worldview. He ordered them to hold their positions and wait for Dachau relief. A desperate rescue operation, codenamed Winter Storm, was launched in December under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, but it stalled a mere 30 miles from the pocket, unable to punch through the tenacious Soviet defenses. Inside the shrinking pocket, the suffering was unimaginable. Soldiers ate their horses, then the leather of their boots, then anything remotely organic they could find. Frostbite and starvation claimed as many lives as Soviet bullets. Field hospitals overflowed with men missing limbs, too weak to stand, suffering from rampant typhus and dysentery. Paulus, his conscience burdened by the unimaginable death toll, kept radioing Hitler for permission to surrender. Hitler kept refusing, his resolve hardening with every casualty. On January 24th, Paulus sent a final stark message: further defense senseless, collapse inevitable. Army requests immediate permission to surrender in order to save lives of remaining troops. Hitler's furious response arrived the same day. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man and the last round. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler taking power, Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal, a chilling and universally understood suicide order. That same day, Hitler delivered a defiant radio address to the German public celebrating the anniversary, notably without mentioning Stalingrad once, a deliberate omission that spoke volumes. The next day, January 31st, Paulus, against Hitler's explicit command, surrendered the southern pocket of Stalingrad. The northern pocket, clinging to life, held out until February 2nd before surrendering as well. The devastating word reached Hitler that morning. Hitler's bizarre obsession with erasing the word Stalingrad revealed something fundamental and deeply disturbing about how he processed reality. He had meticulously constructed an entire worldview around the absolute triumph of willpower over material circumstances, around the unshakable belief that determination, ideological fanaticism, and sheer Aryan will could overcome any obstacle, any numerical disadvantage, any logical impossibility. Stalingrad, however, had brutally disproved this. Soviet soldiers had been more determined, more willing to sacrifice, more fanatical in their defense of their homeland. Soviet generals had outmaneuvered their German counterparts. Soviet industry, against all expectations, had outproduced German factories in key areas. The master race mythology had collided with the harsh, unforgiving reality of the Eastern Front and shattered into a million pieces. But Hitler simply could not accept that narrative. It fundamentally undermined the very foundations of his power and his regime's ideology. So, he attempted to erase the narrative itself. if German newspapers didn't print the word Stalingrad, if radio announcers didn't say it, if official military documents didn't reference it, then perhaps the monumental disaster could fade into a convenient vagueness. People would remember that something bad happened on the Eastern Front, a heavy defeat in the winter fighting, but the excruciating specifics would blur. The sharp, concrete reality of 300,000 men lost at a place called Stalingrad would soften into heavy casualties in winter fighting. The deeply personal contest between Hitler and Stalin would be conveniently forgotten. It didn't work. Obviously. The German public, despite years of relentless propaganda, wasn't fooled. Word spread through whispered conversations in ration queues, through veiled references in letters from soldiers who had miraculously escaped the pocket before the encirclement closed, and crucially, through foreign radio broadcasts that Germans listened to illegally, often risking severe punishment. The name Stalingrad became shorthand for everything the Nazi propaganda machine had promised would never happen. It represented the moment when ordinary Germans began to seriously question whether they were actually going to win the war, a profound crack in the edifice of national confidence. Allied propaganda, acutely aware of the ban, seized on it immediately and relentlessly. British and American radio broadcasts hammered the defeat, knowing that the forbidden word, precisely because it was forbidden, would seep into German consciousness no matter how hard Goebbels tried to suppress it. The word Bonn also created bizarre and often comical practical problems. Military planners desperately needed to discuss what had gone wrong in order to learn from it and prevent future encirclements. But how do you analyze the Battle of Stalingrad without saying Stalingrad? Units were referred to by number and commander rather than by location. After-action reports used absurd euphemisms like the Volga operation or the Southern encirclement. It made clear communication, already a challenge in wartime, nearly impossible. Officers who had fought on other parts of the Eastern Front and wanted to know what had gone wrong so they could avoid similar fates found themselves trying to piece together critical information from vague references and deliberately coded language. Some historians argue that February 2, 1943, marked the true psychological turning point of the war for Germany, even more so than any single military defeat. It was the day Hitler demonstrably showed that he would rather live in a self-constructed delusion than face uncomfortable reality. The German officer corps, which had already been growing skeptical of Hitler's strategic judgment after he took personal command of military operations in late 1941, saw the word ban as stark evidence that their supreme commander had lost his grip on sanity. You can draw a straight line from February 2, 1943 to July 20, 1944, when many of those same disillusioned officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, tried to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb. They knew, by then, they were serving a man who would rather ban words than learn from catastrophic disasters. In the Soviet Union, meanwhile, Stalingrad became the ultimate, unassailable symbol of heroic victory and indomitable national spirit. Stalin ordered massive, jubilant celebrations. The devastated city was rebuilt, rising from the rubble as a magnificent monument to Soviet resilience. The battle was taught in schools, commemorated in countless films and novels, referenced in speeches by Soviet leaders for decades to come. While Hitler tried desperately to erase it from history, Stalin ensured it would be remembered forever, etched into the collective memory of the Soviet people as their finest hour. The naming war that began when Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad in 1925 had, in this grim, ironic way, reached its definitive conclusion. Stalin, in the deepest sense, won. The practical reality of the word ban, for all its initial absurdity, lasted only a few months. By the summer of 1943, it became impossible to maintain. The German military desperately needed to discuss defensive strategies for the Eastern Front, and you simply cannot plan effective defense without acknowledging precisely where your previous defenses had so spectacularly collapsed. The forbidden word gradually crept back into internal military communications, though Hitler still vehemently refused to hear it spoken in his presence. By 1944, even Goebbels, ever the pragmatist beneath the fanaticism, was referencing Stalingrad in propaganda, though now carefully reframed as a martyrdom that would ultimately be avenged. What makes February 2, 1943, so profoundly significant isn't just that Hitler banned a word. It's that he banned a word everyone in Germany was already thinking about constantly. He tried to impose silence on the loudest, most catastrophic disaster in German military history. It demonstrated a fundamental, almost childlike misunderstanding of how information, memory, and public consciousness actually work. You cannot unring a bell. You cannot make 300,000 men disappear from collective memory by simply refusing to name the place where they died. The families receiving those chilling notifications that their sons were missing, presumed dead, didn't care what the official government terminology was. They knew. Everyone knew. The order also marked the point where Hitler's inner circle began, out of sheer necessity, keeping 2 sets of books. There was the fantastical, delusion-laden version of reality that Hitler insisted on living in, and then there was the grim, accurate, and utterly brutal real situation they actually had to manage on the ground. They learned to brief him using carefully chosen language that meticulously avoided triggering his unpredictable rages, while simultaneously conducting the actual war using accurate intelligence and honest, if carefully coded, assessments. This ever-widening split between Hitler's increasingly warped perception and the undeniable reality would only grow more pronounced, more dangerous, as the war dragged on. By 1945, he was moving phantom armies around a map in his underground bunker in Berlin, convinced of victories that existed only in his mind, while the actual armies had long since ceased to exist, ground into dust on battlefields across Europe. It all started on February 2, 1943, with a banned word,